Hi, Emily here from Homemade Emily Jane, and today I'm very excited to share with you how to make Flying Geese quilt blocks using the AccuQuilt Go Mix and Match Cube. Now, if you are new to AccuQuilt and want a more basic overview of how the machine works, check out this tutorial right here and I'll teach you everything you need to know about using an AccuQuilt Go fabric cutting machine. Also, I want to bring your attention to the chapters here on this video. If you want to fast forward to any specific steps, go ahead and check out those chapters and it might help you find what you're looking for a little easier. Now, before we dive into making flying geese, let's talk about what an AccuQuilt Mix and Match Cube really is. The cube, spelt with a Q for quilt, is a set of dies made to work perfectly together to make literally hundreds of different quilt blocks. Each cube is intended to make a specific size block when it's finished, and that includes many different units of piecing put together. So you'll see AccuQuilt makes a lot of different sizes for the Mix and Match Cube, and each cube includes dies to make a Flying Geese quilt block. It also includes dies of different triangle, squares, and rectangle shapes that come together to make lots of different blocks. Each Mix and Match Cube also has companion sets for angles and corners, but we won't get into that during this video. If you want to check out some of my favorite AccuQuilt dies, check out this video right here. One of my favorite techniques for making flying geese is the 4 at a time flying geese method. However, that method involves lots of trimming after you're done piecing your blocks. And one thing I love about using AccuQuilt is that it eliminates that trimming step afterwards if your piecing is precise. So I like to use AccuQuilt whenever possible for flying geese or half square triangles or lots of other blocks that would involve trimming once you're done sewing. AccuQuilt does make some dies specifically intended for making flying geese, but I personally find the Mix and Match Cube much more versatile, so I would actually recommend getting a cube and using the specific dies from that set rather than investing in a die that is only for flying geese. But this is where things do get a little bit more tricky because the sizes of the cube don't necessarily tell you what size flying geese you'll end up with. So make sure you check out this chart right here where I share all of the different sizes that each cube makes for the specific flying geese unit. For instance, you'll see that you can use the 4-inch block cube to make flying geese that finish at 1 inch by 2 inches. You can use the 5-inch block cube to make flying geese that finish at 1 1/4 inch by 2 1/2. The 6-inch block cube makes flying geese that finish at 1 1/2 by 3 inches. The 8-inch block cube makes flying geese that finish at 2 inches by 4 inches, which is one of my favorite sizes of flying geese to make. The 9-inch cube makes 2 1/4 inch by 4 1/2 inch finished flying geese. The 10-inch cube makes 2 1/2 inch by 5 inch finished flying geese, and the 12-inch cube makes 3 inch by 6 inch finished flying geese. I know that can seem a little bit confusing, but basically another way to think about it is if you were to put 8 flying geese into one square to make a finished block that way, that would be the size of the Mix and Match Cube that you'd be looking at. I will go ahead and put links to all of the cubes in the description below for you. Those are affiliate links, so if you do purchase through one of them, I do earn a commission, but it doesn't change your shopping experience at all. So if you're not already a subscriber on my email list, make sure you check out the description below and sign up for my emails. I keep an eye out for those big sales and I try to send out an email every chance there's a really good sale going on. My emails also include lots more free tutorials, tips, and tricks that I know you'll enjoy. So now that we've covered the cube sets as a whole, let's talk about which specific dies that you need to use from the cube set to make your flying geese quilt blocks. Regardless of which size you plan on making, you'll need to grab dies number 4 and 5 out of the set. Die number 4 is a 1/4 square triangle, and you can cut 4 of those shapes for every layer and pass through the AccuQuilt cutting machine. The other die, die number 5, is the half square triangle that goes on the 2 edges of the 1/4 square triangle, and that one, the amount of pieces that you're able to cut will actually depend on which size cube you're using. So you'll see if you're using the 4-inch or 5-inch cube, you can actually cut out 8 of those triangles for each layer of fabric and pass through the machine. If you're using the 6-inch cube, you can get 4 of those triangles, and if you're using any of the other cube sizes, you'll get 2 of the triangles for every layer of fabric and pass through the machine. Another way to put that is if you're using the 4 or 5-inch cube, you can cut out one layer of die number 4 and one layer of die number 5, and you'll end up with 4 finished flying geese. If you're using the Mix and Match Qube 6-inch block, you'll want to cut out 2 layers of die number 5 and 1 layer of die number 4 to end up with 4 finished flying geese. If you're using any of the larger sizes, such as the 8-inch, 9-inch, 10-inch, or 12-inch cube, you'll cut out 4 layers of die number 5 and 1 layer of die number 4 to end up with 4 finished flying geese. Now let's talk about some tips and tricks that I recommend that you keep in mind and practice as you're making flying geese with your AccuQuilt Go Mix and Match Cube. The first thing I like to do anytime that I'm using my AccuQuilt is I make sure to prep my fabric really well using Best Press or your favorite spray starch alternative. I heat up my iron nice and hot, and I put my Best Press in a spray bottle. I personally prefer the unscented of any starch because the scented ones really just bother me as I'm sewing. They make me cough. So I'll spray my fabric with the starch, and then I will iron it to get it nice and crisp and flat. Once my fabric is prepared, you can do a rough cut. Roughly about 1/4 inch extra on all 4 sides will give you enough wiggle room. Once your fabric is cut to the appropriate size, you can go ahead and layer the fabric on your die and then your cutting mat on top. And then go ahead and put that through your machine to end up with your cut pieces. If you're using the AccuQuilt Go Cube, you can cut up to 6 layers of quilting cotton at a time, which is really a huge time saver if you're making a lot of flying geese. Once your pieces are cut, we're ready to start sewing. One of my favorite tips for sewing these flying geese, or really a lot of piecing in general, is to use a leader and an ender while you're sewing. A leader or an ender is simply a piece of scrap fabric that you stitch on prior to sewing your actual pieces, and you don't snip the thread in between. So stitching on the leader and then going into sewing your fabric keeps the threads pulled up and back behind your needle so that they don't get buried and create a nest of thread at the corner of your project. Another way that you can keep your sewing machine from eating the corners of your pieces or creating lots of mess on the corners is to use a straight stitch needle plate. So different machines might come with different options for the needle plate. Mine comes with one that has a big oval shape where the needle hits so that you can do a zigzag stitch or a decorative stitch and the needle can move from side to side. And then my machine also came with a straight stitch plate which has just one little tiny hole where the needle goes in and out. And having a smaller hole means there's less room for the fabric to get dragged down into the machine. One more thing that I recommend to keep in mind as you are sewing is to use a 1/4 inch foot on your sewing machine. Some 1/4 inch feet have a guide on them and some do not, so I recommend trying out both and seeing which one you like the best. If you want more tips for sewing a perfect 1/4 inch seam, here's a really fun video that you might enjoy. And just like any time that you're sewing, I want to remind you to use a sharp new needle. Switching out your needle between every project or every couple of projects can really help. And make sure that the needle that you're using is the right size and type for the project that you're working on. So the fabric that I'm using is quilting cotton, and I like to use roughly a size 80/12 for this type of fabric. To make your flying geese, you'll begin by taking that 1/4 square triangle, lining it up with 1/2 square triangle, and stitching a nice straight seam right at that 1/4 inch, scant 1/4 inch line. When you are getting ready to press both seams, I like to set my seam first by placing that hot iron down on the block before opening it up. That just kind of gets those fibers of the thread nice and flat. And then I open up the seam and press it again to press the seam open. I like to press my seams open when I'm doing these flying geese. And then you can go ahead and add on the second side of your flying geese. I tend to do the right side first and then the left, but you can try out different techniques and find out what works best for you. Once your second side is sewn on, again, press that seam open nice and flat, and maybe you give it another little spritz of Best Press. Once both seams are sewn on and pressed flat, your flying geese should be pretty dang close to the size that you're aiming for. Go ahead and measure your flying geese and make sure that there is a 1/4 inch of that background fabric, the smaller triangles at the top, so that you have that for seam allowance. and see if maybe some trimming might help. I personally prefer to practice the stitching part to get it as precise as possible so that I can forego trimming later on. Ensuring accurate piecing throughout the process saves a lot of time later on with trimming, so make sure that you practice and get those seams nice and straight. I really hope this tutorial on how to make flying geese with the AccuQuilt Qube was very helpful for you. If you want a quilt pattern to follow to make flying geese in a quilt, I have a few that I highly recommend. You can always visit homadeemilykjane.com for lots of quilt patterns. Many of my patterns are AccuQuilt friendly and include special instructions for using the AccuQuilt. One that I recommend is a newer pattern in my shop. It's called the Blessings quilt pattern. Blessings uses a ton of flying geese. It's really fun to make, and it's a really great opportunity to practice those flying geese quilt blocks. It's scrap friendly or fat quarter friendly, so you probably already have fabrics in your stash just waiting to be used. Some other AccuQuilt friendly popular flying geese quilt patterns that I have available are the Beaming quilt pattern, which uses the flying geese shapes that we discussed today. Also, the Limelight quilt pattern and the Keystone quilt pattern. So I highly encourage you to check those out and use your AccuQuilt to make them. If you have any questions whatsoever, please drop them in the comments below. I'm always happy to help and answer those questions for you. If you want to learn more about AccuQuilt or find more tutorials, make sure you check out the AccuQuilt section on homadeemilykjane.com, and stay tuned here on YouTube for lots more quilting tips, tricks, and techniques. Happy sewing!